Step into the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where a celebrated novelist, Eleanor Vance, vanishes after a book signing, leaving behind only a pen cap and a trail of secrets. Was it her desperate publisher, driven by greed for her unpublished masterpiece? A fan, lost in obsessive devotion? A stern librarian, guarding a hidden truth? Or a bitter critic, seeking revenge? Join Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a web of motives, greed, love, loyalty, and pride to uncover the chilling truth behind the gilded cage. In just 30 seconds, a mystery unfolds that will keep you guessing until the final page. Chapter 1. The signing. The autumn sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. The village, usually drowsy under such September warmth, hummed with an uncommon energy. Mr. P. bookshop, a narrow building with creaking floors and shelves groaning under the weight of well-loved volumes, was the epicenter of this bustle. For today, Eleanor Vance, the celebrated author of Gothic novels, was to grace the shop with the signing of her latest work, The Shadowed Veil. The event had drawn a motley crowd, villagers clutching dog-eared copies, curious passers-by, and a handful of literary enthusiasts from beyond the parish bounds. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed corner by the shop's small hearth, her knitting needles clicking softly, a delicate shawl draped over her shoulders despite the mild weather. Her eyes, bright and sharp as a sparrow's, missed nothing. She had declined to join the queue, content to observe the scene with that quiet acuity that so often surprised those who mistook her for a frail old spinster. Eleanor Vance, seated at a table draped in green baize, was a slight woman in her 40s, her dark hair pinned neatly but her hands betraying a nervous tremor as she signed book after book. Her smile, though polite, seemed strained, and Miss Marple noted the way her gaze darted occasionally to the shop's door, as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. The crowd was a study in contrasts. Mr. Harold Grayson, Eleanor's publisher, loomed near the table, his broad frame clad in a suit that spoke of London wealth but was ill-suited to the village's rustic charm. His florid face glistened with perspiration, and he adjusted his tie with impatient fingers, barking occasional instructions to Mr. Pym, who hovered anxiously nearby. Miss Clara Trent, a young woman with a fervent gleam in her eyes, clutched her copy of The Shadowed Veil as if it were a sacred relic. She lingered at the edge of the queue, her lips moving silently as she rehearsed words she would never dare speak aloud to her idol. Mrs. Lydia Brooke, the village librarian, stood apart, her severe posture and tightly pursed lips suggesting a disapproval of the fuss, though she had organized the event with her usual efficiency. And then there was Mr. Vincent Quill, the literary critic, whose lean figure and sardonic smile cut through the crowd like a knife. His presence puzzled Miss Marple. His scathing review of Eleanor's last novel had sparked a minor scandal. Yet here he was, watching her with an intensity that bordered on predatory. The afternoon wore on. The queue dwindled, and the shop grew quieter. Eleanor signed her final book, her pen scratching a dedication for a blushing schoolgirl. Mr. Pym, pale and coughing, announced the event's end and began ushering stragglers out. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, noted the time, 5:30. She stepped into the street, intending to return home for tea, when she heard a faint commotion. Mr. Pym, flustered, was calling for Eleanor. Her coat still hung on the rack. By the door, her fountain pen lay abandoned on the table, and her car, a modest Morris Minor, stood, untouched, in the lane behind the shop. Yet Eleanor Vance was gone by dusk. The village was alight with whispers. The novelist had vanished without a word, leaving no trace. Miss Marple, standing at her garden gate, watched the last of the crowd disperse, her mind already turning over the faces she had seen that day. How curious, she murmured to herself, her fingers pausing on the latch. People do not simply vanish, not without reason, and reasons, I find, are often written in the glances they try to hide. She turned toward her cottage, resolved to keep a close eye on St. Mary Mead's latest mystery. Chapter 2. The inquiry begins the morning after Eleanor Vance's disappearance. St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, as if the weather itself sensed the unease that had settled over the village. The high street, usually alive with the cheerful clatter of milk bottles and the chatter of early risers, was subdued, the air thick with speculation. By 9 o'clock, the news had spread from the post office to the vicarage. The celebrated novelist, last seen at Mr. Pym's bookshop, had vanished without a trace. The villagers, ever fond of a mystery, gathered in small knots, their voices, low but eager, each offering a theory more fanciful than the last. Some spoke of a secret lover, others of a sudden illness, and a few whispered of foul play. Their eyes darting toward the bookshop's shuttered windows, Miss Jane Marple, seated in her chin-skirted parlor at Mead Cottage, was immune to such history. Her knitting needles moved with their usual steady rhythm, a soft click-click that punctuated the silence as she sipped her morning tea. The fire in the grate cast a warm glow on her delicate features, but her eyes, bright and unyielding, betrayed the activity of her mind. She had not slept as soundly as usual, her thoughts returning again and again to the scene at the bookshop. Eleanor's nervous smile, the publisher's restless energy, the fan's fervent gaze, the librarian's rigid composure, and the critic's sharp, predatory stare. Each, she mused, had a story, and stories, in her experience, were rarely as simple as they seemed. The doorbell chimed, a sharp note that startled her young maid, Lily, who hurried to answer it. Inspector Craddock stepped into the parlor, his hat in hand, his face a mixture of determination and faint exasperation. He was a tall man, not yet 40, with a soldier's bearing and a policeman's pragmatism, though Miss Marple knew him well enough to detect the flicker of uncertainty. That came with a case as peculiar as this one. He had worked with her before, and while he respected her insight, he sometimes found her methods, those gentle, almost absent-minded observations, maddeningly indirect. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the armchair she indicated. "I trust you've heard about Miss Vance." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "The entire village has heard, Inspector. A most distressing affair. Have you any news?" Craddock sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Precious little, I'm afraid. We've searched the bookshop, her hotel room at the Blue Boar, and her car. No signs of a struggle, no note, no indication she planned to leave. Her luggage is still at the hotel, her toiletries untouched. It's as if she stepped out for a moment and never returned." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a fraction of a second. "How curious," she said softly. "People, Inspector, are not so different from books. The quiet ones often hide the most secrets. Have you spoken to those who were with her yesterday?" Craddock nodded, pulling a notebook from his pocket. "We're starting with the obvious. The people at the signing. Mr. Pym. The bookshop owner was unwell and left early, so he saw nothing after 4 o'clock. The 4 who stayed longest were Mr. Harold Grayson, her publisher, Miss Clara Trent, a fan, Mrs. Lydia Brooke, the librarian who organized the event, and Mr. Vincent Quill, that critic who wrote such a nasty piece about her last book. I'll be interviewing them today, but I thought—" He hesitated, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I thought you might have some thoughts, Miss Marple." She smiled, a gentle, almost mischievous curve of her lips. "You are kind to humor. An old woman, Inspector. I have no thoughts, only observations. But I do wonder about those 4. Each, I suspect, had a reason to be near Miss Vance, and reasons, you know, can be as revealing as footprints. Might I suggest you begin with their movements after the signing? And perhaps," she added, her eyes twinkling, "you might ask what they wanted from her. For I fancy Miss Vance was more than a novelist to them, she was a prize." Craddock jotted a note, his brow furrowing. A prize? You think this is about money? Money, or something more personal, Miss Marple replied, her needles resuming their rhythm. Miss Vance's novels are successful, are they not? Success breeds envy, devotion, even desperation. I recall a young woman in my nephew's village, quite a different matter, of course, but she too vanished, and it was all because of what others wanted from her. A manuscript, a reputation, a confession. Who can say? Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. I'll start with Grayson. He's staying at the Blue Boar, same as Miss Vance. If you hear anything in the village, Miss Marple, I shall be sure to let you know, she promised. Her voice mild, but her mind already turning over the possibilities. As Craddock departed, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gazed out the window at the garden, where the last roses of summer clung stubbornly to their stems. She thought of Eleanor Vance, a woman whose stories wove shadows and secrets, and wondered what shadow had fallen over her. The village, she knew, would be a wellspring of gossip, and gossip, when sifted carefully, often held grains of truth. She resolved to take her usual walk to the post office, where Mrs. Muggins, the postmistress, was sure to have overheard something useful. The post office was a hub of activity, its counter crowded with villagers posting letters or collecting parcels, all while exchanging tidbits about the vanished novelist. Miss Marple, her basket over her arm, greeted Mrs. Muggins with a smile. The postmistress, a stout woman with a voice that carried, was in her element, regaling a small audience with her version of events. She was there 1 minute, signing away, and the next poof, gone, Mrs. Muggins declared, her hands fluttering dramatically. I saw that Mr. Grayson, the publisher fellow, looking all red and bothered, left in a tearing hurry. He did, nearly knocked over poor Miss Trent in the doorway. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Miss Trent? The young lady, with the book. Oh, aye, Mrs. Muggins said, leaning forward. Clutched it like it was her own child. Stayed till the end. She did, mooning over Miss Vance. I saw her later, too, pacing up and down the lane by the bookshop. Long after everyone else had gone. Looked proper upset. She did. Miss Marple nodded, her face betraying nothing but polite interest. And Mrs. Brooke? She organized the event, I believe. Mrs. Muggins sniffed. Stiff as a board, that one. Locked up the shop herself, seeing as Mr. Pym was poorly. Didn't say a word to anyone, just marched off home. Mind you, she's always been odd about Miss Vance's books. Keeps them under lock and key in that library of hers, like they're the crown jewels. And Mr. Quill, Miss Marple prompted gently. That nasty critic? Mrs. Muggins's eyes narrowed. Skulking about, he was, with that smirk of his. I heard him muttering to Miss Vance before the signing started something about her work not being her own. Bold as brass, if you ask me. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Muggins, and purchased a few stamps, her mind cataloguing each detail. Clara Trent's, lingering, Grayson's haste, Brooke's silence. Quill's venom each was a thread in a tapestry she could not yet see. She returned home, pausing only to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry, who was pruning her roses with rather more vigor than necessary. Dolly, my dear, Miss Marple said, pausing at the gate, have you heard anything about Mr. Gray's business? I understand he publishes Miss Vance's novels. Mrs. Bantry, always eager for a chat, leaned over the fence. Oh, Jane, it's a dreadful business, isn't it? Arthur heard from his cousin in London that Grayson and Sons is in dire straits, overextended themselves, apparently, banking on Miss Vance's next book to pull them out of the red. Arthur says Grayson's been borrowing heavily, quite the talk in the city. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. How interesting. A man in debt is a man in a hurry, and hurries often lead to mistakes. Thank you, Dolly. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her stitches. Grayson's financial troubles suggested a motive, but motives, she knew, were not enough. Clara Trent's devotion, Lydia Brooke's protectiveness, Vincent Quill's bitterness, each could be a spark, but which had ignited? She recalled a case in her youth, when a vicar's wife had disappeared after a church fete, only to be found hiding in a neighbor's attic, driven by a fear no one had suspected. Fear, or perhaps greed, could drive people to extraordinary lengths. By afternoon, Craddock telephoned, his voice brisk. "I've spoken to Grayson. Says he left a signing at 5, to catch a train to London. The station master confirms a train left at 5:15, but I'm checking if he was on it. Miss Trent claims she went straight home after getting her book signed. Mrs. Brooke says she locked up at 6 and saw nothing unusual. Quill insists he left early, didn't even speak to Miss Vance after their argument. None of them saw her leave." Miss Marple listened, her fingers still, and Mr. Pym. "Still under the weather, but he confirms Mrs. Brooke locked up. Says Miss Vance was at the table when he left." Jane Miss Marple. "I mean, do you think this is a kidnapping?" Miss Marple considered. "It is too early to say, Inspector, but I think you should look closely at Mr. Grayson's train, and perhaps," she added, almost as an afterthought, "you might ask Mrs. Brooke about the back door of the bookshop. It faces a quiet lane, does it not? A lane where a car might come and go unnoticed?" Craddock promised to follow up, and Miss Marple hung up, her mind alight with possibilities. She thought of Eleanor Vance, a woman whose novels spun tales of hidden rooms and secret betrayals. Perhaps, she mused, the truth lay in something equally hidden: a glance, a word, a moment overlooked. She resolved to visit the bookshop herself, to see what clues might linger in its dusty corners. For Miss Marple knew that mysteries, like her knitting, unraveled one stitch at a time, and she was nothing if not patient. Chapter 3. The publisher's ambition. The late morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Dame Mead Cottage, casting intricate patterns on the worn rug where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. The village of St. Mary Mead, though still abuzz with talk of Eleanor Vance's disappearance, had settled into a quieter rhythm, as if holding its breath for news. Miss Marple, however, was not one to wait idly. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, turned over the threads of the previous day's observations, each a potential clue to the novelist's fate. Inspector Craddock's call had confirmed her suspicions. The case was no simple matter of a wayward author, but something deeper, perhaps darker. Her thoughts lingered on Harold Grayson, the publisher, whose flushed face and hurried exit from the bookshop had struck her as more than mere impatience. Grayson, she knew, was a man of ambition, the sort who wore his success like his tailored suits boldly, but with a hint of strain. Mrs. Bantry's gossip about his financial troubles had planted a seed, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, suspected that seed might bear fruit. She recalled a grocer in her youth, a man whose debts had driven him to desperate acts, not unlike the desperation she sensed in Grayson's restless demeanor. A man in want, she murmured to herself, is a man who acts, and not always, wisely. At 10:30, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her basket over her arm, and set out for the Blue Boar, the village inn where Grayson was staying. The inn, a sturdy building with ivy-clad walls, was a favorite haunt for travelers, its taproom a repository of village lore. Miss Marple, under the pretense of inquiring about a church fundraiser, hoped to glean something from the inn staff, who were as observant as they were discreet and less gently prodded. The landlord, Mr. Higgs, greeted her with a nod, his broad face creased with the strain of recent events. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, polishing a glass behind the bar. "Terrible business about Miss Vance. The police were here at dawn, asking after Mr. Grayson." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. "Indeed. And what did you tell them, Mr. Higgs?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Not much, to tell truth be told. Mr. Grayson's been here since Friday, keeping to himself mostly. Ordered a whiskey last night, late, and looked proper out of sorts. Kept muttering about contracts and deadlines. I heard him on the telephone, too, arguing with someone, couldn't catch the words, but he was in a right state. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild sympathy. How distressing for him. Did he mention Miss Vance at all? Not directly, Mr. Higgs said. But he did say something about a book being his salvation. Reckon he meant Miss Vance's next one. Everyone knows her novels keep his firm afloat. Thanking him, Miss Marple made her way to the inn's small lounge, where she found Mrs. Higgs arranging flowers. The landlady, a cheerful woman with a knack for detail, was more forthcoming. "Oh, Miss Marple, that Mr. Grayson's a queer one," she confided, snipping a wilted rose. "Came back from the bookshop yesterday, all in a fluster, coat all askew. Said he was catching the 5:15 to London, but I saw him in the lane behind the inn at 6:30, pacing like a caged lion. Nearly jumped when I called out to him." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her basket. 6:30. How curious. The train would have left by then, surely. Mrs. Higgs nodded. "Aye, that's what I thought. But he didn't leave the inn again till this morning, when the police came knocking." Armed with this tidbit, Miss Marple returned home, her mind weaving a new pattern. Grayson's claim of catching the train was suspect, and his presence in the lane suggested he had not left St. Mary Mead as he'd told Craddock. She telephoned the inspector, her voice as calm as ever. "Inspector, have you confirmed Mr. train journey? I understand he was seen in the village after the time he claimed to have left." Craddock, at the police station, was already grappling with the same question. "We're checking the station records now, Miss Marple. The 5:15 was delayed by 20 minutes, but the porter doesn't recall seeing Grayson. I'm heading to the Blue Boar to press him further." "Very wise," Miss Marple said. "And perhaps you might inquire about his business dealings. A man whose fortunes rest on another's work may act rashly to secure it." Craddock's interview with Grayson, conducted in the inn's private parlor, was less illuminating than he'd hoped. Grayson, his jowls quivering with indignation, insisted he had left the bookshop at 5, driven to the station, and boarded the train. "I had urgent business in London," he said, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Contracts to review, authors to meet. I didn't see Miss Vance after she finished signing. She was still at the table when I left." Craddock, his notebook open, pressed further. "And what was your business with Miss Vance yesterday? You were seen speaking to her before the signing." Grayson's eyes flickered, but he recovered quickly. "A routine discussion. Royalties, publication schedules. She's our star author, you know. Her next book, The Gilded Cage, is set to be a sensation." Craddock noted the enthusiasm, but also the strain in Grayson's voice. "And where is this manuscript now?" Grayson hesitated, just a fraction too long. "With Miss Vance, I presume. She's very particular about her work. Keeps it close until it's ready." Unsatisfied but lacking evidence to detain him, Craddock let Grayson go, promising to follow up. He telephoned Miss Marple from the station, relaying the conversation. "He's sticking to his story, but it doesn't add up." The porter's certain no one matching Grayson's description was at the platform, and that business about the manuscripts sounded like he was fishing for something. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, considered this. "A manuscript, Inspector, is a powerful thing. It holds dreams, secrets, and sometimes salvation. I recall a young poet in my village years ago. His work was stolen by a friend in need, and the betrayal cut deeper than any knife. If Mr. Grayson's firm is struggling, as I've heard, the Gilded Cage might be his lifeline. You might ask Mr. Pym if he overheard anything between Grayson and Miss Vance. Publishers, you see, are not always content to wait for their prizes." Craddock, grateful but slightly bemused, agreed to visit the bookshop. Mr. Pym, though still pale from his illness, was back at his counter, surrounded by stacks of unsold copies of The Shadowed Veil. He greeted Craddock with a nervous cough, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting Eleanor to reappear. "I didn't see much, Inspector," he said, wringing his hands. "I was feeling poorly, so I left early. Mrs. Brooke took charge, locked up after the signing. But I did hear Mr. Grayson talking to Miss Vance before the event started. He was pressing her about her new book, saying it was vital to get it out by Christmas. She didn't seem pleased, kept saying she wasn't ready." Craddock jotted this down, his suspicions deepening. "And did Grayson leave before you?" "Oh yes," Mr. Pym said. "He was gone by 5, or so I thought. I was in the back room, resting, so I can't be sure. But Mrs. Brooke would know. She was the last to leave." Miss Marple, when informed of this, tilted her head thoughtfully. How interesting that Mrs. Brooke was the last, and yet she saw nothing. "I wonder, Inspector, if you might look at the bookshop's back door. It opens onto a lane, does it not? A quiet place, where one might slip away unnoticed." Craddock promised to investigate, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind racing. Grayson's ambition, she suspected, was no mere desire for profit. It was a hunger, the kind that drove men to cross lines they would not otherwise tread. She thought of Eleanor Vance, a woman whose stories spun webs of intrigue, and wondered if Grayson had spun a web of his own. The manuscript, the gilded cage, loomed large in her thoughts, a prize worth stealing, perhaps even worth hiding, woman to secure. She resolved to keep a close eye on Grayson, for ambition, she knew, was a flame that could burn both the bearer and those around him. Chapter 4. The fan's devotion. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, its light softened by a veil of clouds that promised rain. The village, though still murmuring about Eleanor Vance's disappearance, had begun to resume its daily routines, with shopkeepers sweeping doorsteps and children darting through the lanes. Miss Jane Marple, however, was far from distracted by such normalcy. Seated in her parlor, her knitting a delicate web in her lap, she turned her thoughts to Clara Trent, the young woman whose fervent devotion to Eleanor had caught her eye at the bookshop. There was something in Clara's wide-eyed intensity, Miss Marple mused, that reminded her of a girl from her youth, a quiet soul, whose adoration of a local curate had led to a small but telling scandal. "Devotion," she said softly to herself, "can be a light that blinds as much as it illuminates." Clara Trent, Miss Marple had learned, was a newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having arrived only a year ago to care for an ailing aunt. She lived in a modest cottage on the edge of the village, its garden overgrown with nettles, a stark contrast to the neat hedges of its neighbors. The villagers spoke kindly of her, if with a touch of pity, noting her solitary habits and her habit of clutching Eleanor's novels as if they were talismans. Miss Marple, ever curious about the human heart, decided a visit to Clara might shed light on the novelist's fate. She donned her coat, took up her basket, and set out. Her steps measured but purposeful. The Trent cottage was a small, ivy-covered affair, its windows dim with dust. Miss Marple knocked, and after a moment Clara opened the door, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying. She wore a simple dress, and in her hand was a well-worn copy of The Shadowed Veil, its pages marked with countless slips of paper. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "is there news of Miss Vance?" "Not yet, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "I thought you might be distressed, being such an admirer of hers." "May I come in?" Clara hesitated, then stepped aside, leading Miss Marple into a cramped sitting room cluttered with books and papers, all bearing Eleanor's name. A photograph of the novelist, clipped from a newspaper, was pinned to the wall, its edges curling. Miss Marple settled into a faded armchair, her eyes taking in every detail: the ink-stained desk, the half-burned candle, the faint scent of lavender that clung to Clara's shawl. "You were at the signing," Miss Marple began, her voice soft as a lullaby. It must have been a thrill to meet Miss Vance. Clara's face lit up, then clouded. It was everything, she said, clutching her book. Her stories, they're like worlds I can live in. She was so kind, signing my book, but she seemed worried. I wanted to stay, to help her, but she told me to go home. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing in her basket. And did you go home, dear? I understand you were seen near the bookshop later that evening. Clara's eyes widened, and she gripped the book tighter, her knuckles whitening. I went back, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't help it. I wanted to see her again, to make sure she was all right. She's so important, you see. Her stories, they save people like me. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. Save you, my dear. That's a strong word. Clara flushed, her fingers tracing the book's spine. I mean, they give me hope. I've not had an easy life, Miss Marple. My parents are gone. My aunt was cruel before she passed. Miss Vance's books, they're about people who survive, who find light in the dark. I thought if I could just talk to her, tell her what her words mean. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone kind but firm. And when you went back, what did you see? Clara swallowed, her eyes darting to the window. It was nearly dark. The shop was closed, but I saw Mr. Grayson in the lane, arguing with someone on his telephone. He was angry, saying something about a deadline being impossible. Then he got into a car and drove off. I didn't see Miss Vance, but her car was still there. I waited a bit, then went home. I swear, I only wanted to help her. Miss Marple studied Clara, noting the tremor in her hands, the desperate sincerity in her voice. She thought of a maid in her youth, whose love for a soldier had led her to follow him through the village, unseen, her heart breaking with every step. Devotion, she said gently, can make us see what we wish to see, not what is. Thank you, Clara. You've been most helpful. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind turned over Clara's words. The girl's obsession was clear. But was it dangerous? Her account of Grayson's presence in the lane corroborated Mrs. Higgs's story, casting further doubt on his alibi. Miss Marple decided to share this with Inspector Craddock, who was at the police station. Sifting through statements with growing frustration, she telephoned him from the village call box, her voice clear despite the crackle of the line. Inspector, I've spoken to Miss Trent. She confirms seeing Mr. Grayson in the lane behind the bookshop, after the time he claims to have left for London. She's a devoted fan, perhaps too devoted, but I doubt she has the strength for anything more than watching from afar. You might ask her to repeat her story, though she may recall more than she realizes. Craddock, his notebook already thick with notes, thanked her. I'll bring her in, Miss Marple. She's the second person to place Grayson there. I'm starting to think he's our man, but we've no proof yet. No sign of Miss Vance. Either her hotel room's clean, and her car hasn't moved. I'm sending a constable to check the lane for tire marks or anything else. Miss Marple returned home, pausing to chat with Mrs. Bantry, who was in her garden, wielding a pair of shears with enthusiasm. Jane, you're sleuthing again, aren't you? Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes gleaming. What's this about Clara Trent? I heard she's positively besotted with Miss Vance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She is, Dolly, but devotion is a curious thing. It can bind, or it can blind. I recall a young woman in my nephew's village, quite different, of course, but she followed a singer about, convinced he was her destiny. It ended in tears, not crime. I wonder if Clara's love for Miss Vance is the same. Mrs. Bantry lowered her shears. You don't think she did something to her, do you? I think, Miss Marple said, that Clara sees Miss Vance as more than a person's. She's a dream. Dreams can inspire, but they can also distort. I shall keep an eye on her. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her stitches. Clara's devotion was genuine, but her presence in the lane suggested she knew more than she had told. Had she seen something she didn't understand, or was she hiding a deeper involvement? Miss Marple thought of Grayson, his ambition a stark contrast to Clara's adoration, yet both could lead to rash acts. She recalled a line from Eleanor's novel, "The shadowed veil, love and greed wear different masks, but their shadows fall the same." The manuscript, the gilded cage, loomed in her mind, a prize that might draw both the greedy and the devoted into its orbit. She resolved to visit the bookshop tomorrow to see if the lane held any secrets Clara had missed. For in St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, every loose thread led somewhere. Chapter 5. The librarian's secret. The rain that had threatened St. Mary Mead all morning arrived by noon, a steady drizzle that turned the high street into a glistening ribbon of cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, pulled on her sturdy mackintosh and set out for the village library, her umbrella a shield against the damp. Her thoughts were fixed on Mrs. Lydia Brooke, the librarian whose stern efficiency had orchestrated Eleanor Vance's book signing. There was something in Lydia's rigid composure at the event, Miss Marple reflected, that hinted at more than mere professionalism, a guardedness. Perhaps that suggested a secret held close. She recalled a schoolmistress from her youth, whose prim exterior had hidden a fierce loyalty to a wayward sister, a loyalty that led to unexpected choices. Protectiveness, Miss Marple murmured, her breath misting in the chill air, can be as much a motive as greed or love. The library, a squat stone building tucked behind the church, was a haven of order, its shelves aligned with military precision. Mrs. Brooke stood at the counter, her glasses perched on her nose, cataloging returns with a pen that moved as sharply as her gaze. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, shaking rain from her umbrella, and offered a curt nod. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped, "I suppose you're here about Miss Vance. The police have already been asking their questions." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that belied their sharpness. "Indeed, Mrs. Brooke, but I'm not the police. I thought you might share a little of what you saw at the bookshop. You were the last to leave, were you not?" Lydia's pen paused, and for a moment, her face betrayed a flicker of unease, quickly masked. "I was," she said, setting the pen down. "Mr. Pym was unwell, so I locked up after the signing. Miss Vance was still at the table when I checked the back room. I assumed she left through the front door before I returned to lock it. I saw nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Nothing at all, not even a sound in the lane behind the shop. I understand it's a quiet place, easily overlooked." Lydia's lips tightened, and she busied herself with a stack of books. "The lane, I didn't notice anything. I was focused on securing the shop. It was a busy evening, Miss Marple, with all those people milling about." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the shelves behind Lydia, where a glass-fronted case held a collection of manuscripts, their edges yellowed but meticulously preserved. A small plaque read, "Eleanor Vance Early Drafts. Donated 1952. "What a treasure," Miss Marple remarked, stepping closer. "You must be very proud to care for Miss Vance's work. She's fortunate to have such a dedicated guardian." Lydia's posture softened, though her eyes remained wary. "Her novels are important," she said. "They're not just stories, they're art. I've known Eleanor since she first published. She trusted me to keep these drafts safe, away from those who'd exploit them." Miss Marple's fingers brushed her basket, her mind noting the edge in Lydia's voice. "Exploit, a strong word. Do you mean her publisher, perhaps?" Mr. Grayson seemed quite eager at the signing. Lydia sniffed, adjusting her glasses. "Grayson's a vulture, like all publishers, always pushing for more, faster, as if genius can be rushed. Eleanor deserved better. She told me once she regretted signing with him, said he cared more for profit than her craft." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "How interesting. And did she speak of her new manuscript, The Gilded Cage. I've heard it's her finest yet. Lydia hesitated, her hands stilling on the books. She mentioned it, she said carefully. Said it was personal, not ready for the world. I told her to take her time, but Grayson was hounding her. I heard them arguing before the signing. He wanted it by month's end. Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts turning to the lane behind the bookshop. She thanked Lydia and left, pausing under the library's awning to consider her next move. The librarian's protectiveness was palpable, but was it merely loyalty to a friend, or something more? Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress who had hidden a stolen brooch, not for gain, but to shield a loved one's reputation. Loyalty, she knew, could lead to silence, and silence to complicity. She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice steady despite the rain drumming on her umbrella. Inspector, I've spoken to Mrs. Brooke. She insists she saw nothing unusual, but I find her reticence curious. She's fiercely protective of Miss Vance's work, and I wonder if she might have overlooked something in the lane to spare her. Friend distress. Have you checked for any signs there? Craddock, at the station, sounded weary. We've combed the lane, Miss Marple. Found a few tire marks, but they're indistinct, could be anyone's. No witnesses. Though a neighbor mentioned hearing a car around 6:30. Mrs. Brooke didn't mention it, which is odd, since she was there. I'm bringing her in for a formal statement. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Very wise. And perhaps you might ask about her feelings toward Mr. Grayson. There's a tension there, I think, that bears exploring. Returning home, Miss Marple found Mrs. Bantry waiting at her gate, her raincoat bright against the gray day. Jane, you're positively drenched, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. What's this about Lydia Brooke? I heard she was cross as two sticks when the police came by. Miss Marple invited her in, setting the kettle on. Lydia is a woman of principle, she said, pouring tea. But principles can blind one to truth. She spoke of Mr. Grayson with disdain, and I wonder if she knows more about his dealings with Miss Vance than she lets on. I recall a governess in my youth quite different, of course, but she kept silent about a theft to protect someone she admired. It ended badly, I'm afraid. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You think Lydia's covering for someone? Grayson, perhaps? Not covering, perhaps, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly, but choosing not to see. She locked the bookshop, Dolly, and yet she heard no car, saw no sign of Miss Vance leaving. It's possible she turned a blind eye, out of loyalty or fear. Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea, thoughtful. She's always been odd about Eleanor's books. Keeps those drafts like they're sacred. I suppose if she thought Grayson was pressuring her, she might, well, not help him, but not stop him either. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the manuscript, The Gilded Cage, a work that seemed to draw all eyes. Grayson's ambition, Clara's devotion, and now Lydia's protectiveness. She recalled a line from Eleanor's earlier novel, secrets are kept not by walls, but by hearts that choose to guard them. Had Lydia's heart guarded a secret, knowingly or not? Miss Marple resolved to visit the bookshop lane herself, to see if the rain had uncovered any clues Craddock's men had missed. For, in St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, the smallest snag could unravel the entire pattern. Chapter 6. The critic's venom. The drizzle had softened to a fine mist by the time Miss Jane Marple stepped out of Dame Mead Cottage the following morning, her umbrella tucked under her arm and her basket swinging lightly. The air in St. Mary Mead carried a damp chill, but the village was stirring with its usual rhythm, milk bottles clinking, the baker's van rattling down the high street. Yet beneath this surface calm, the mystery of Eleanor Vance's disappearance pulsed like a hidden current. Miss Marple's thoughts were now fixed on Vincent Quill, the literary critic whose sharp tongue had cast a shadow over Eleanor's career. His presence at the bookshop, so incongruous given his public scorn for her work, intrigued her. She recalled a solicitor in her youth, whose biting words had masked a deeper grudge. one that led to a quiet but devastating act of revenge. Words, she murmured, her breath visible in the cool air, can wound, but they also reveal. Vincent Quill was staying at a small guest house on the outskirts of the village, a place favored by those seeking privacy rather than the bustle of the Blue Boar. Miss Marple, under the guise of delivering a church circular, made her way there, her steps deliberate on the slick cobblestones. The guest house, a converted farmhouse with sagging eaves, was quiet, its garden overgrown with late-blooming asters. The proprietress, Mrs. Cutler, a wiry woman with a keen eye for her guests' habits, greeted Miss Marple at the door. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, wiping her hands on an apron. "Come about that poor Miss Vance, I reckon. The whole village is talking." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Just a small errand, Mrs. Cutler, but I wouldn't mind. A word about Mr. Quill. He's a guest here, is he not?" Mrs. Cutler nodded, ushering her into a cozy parlor where a fire crackled. "I been here 3 days. Keeps to himself, mostly, scribbling in that notebook of his. Came back from the bookshop in a foul mood, though. Snapped at my girl when she offered him tea. Said he had work to do and didn't want disturbing." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did he say anything about Miss Vance?" "I understand he was at her signing." "Not a word about her," Mrs. Cutler replied, lowering her voice. "But I overheard him on the telephone that evening, talking to someone about setting things right. Sounded cross, like he'd been slighted. He left the house around 6, came back near 8, looking like he'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple filed this away, her fingers brushing the edge of her basket. "How curious. Did he mention where he'd been?" Mrs. Cutler shook her head. "Not a peep. But he's not the sort to chat, is he? Always got that sneer, like he's above us all." Thanking her, Miss Marple left the circular and made her way back to the village, her mind turning over Quill's movements. His argument with Eleanor, noted by Mrs. Muggins, suggested a personal animus, and his late return to the guest house placed him in the village during the critical hours of Eleanor's disappearance. She recalled a line from The Shadowed Veil. "Hatred is a mirror, reflecting the flaws of the one who wields it." Had Quill's venom, so publicly displayed, driven him to more than words? She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice calm but precise. "Inspector, I've learned Mr. Quill was out of his guest house between 6 and 8. The evening Miss Vance vanished, he was heard speaking of setting things right, which may mean nothing or everything. I suggest you ask him about his quarrel with Miss Vance. A critic's pride, you know, can be as fragile as any artist's." Craddock, at the station, was sifting through reports, his patience fraying. "Quill's next on my list, Miss Marple. He claims he left the bookshop by 4:30, before the signing ended, and went for a walk to clear his head. Says he didn't see Miss Vance after their argument, but I'm not convinced he's too smug, too quick with his answers." Miss Marple nodded to herself. "A man who writes to wound, Inspector, often has wounds of his own. You might inquire about his reasons for attending the signing. Critics rarely mingle with those they scorn unless they seek something attention, perhaps, or retribution." Craddock's interview with Quill, conducted in the station's sparse interview room, was a study in contrasts. Quill, lean and angular, sat with a posture that suggested both arrogance and unease, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. His dark suit was immaculate, but his eyes, sharp and restless, betrayed a mind at work. Craddock, his notebook open, began with a directness that bordered on blunt. "Mr. Quill, you argued with Miss Vance before the signing. Care to explain?" Quill's lips curled into a faint smirk. "A professional disagreement, Inspector. I questioned the originality of her work. Her last novel bore a striking resemblance to a lesser-known Victorian tale. She took offense, as authors do. It was nothing more." Craddock leaned forward. "Nothing more. You wrote a review that all but called her a fraud. Why attend her signing if you think so little of her?" Quill shrugged, his fingers stilling. Curiosity. I wanted to see if her fans were as blind as she is. Besides, I'm writing a piece on the state of modern literature. She's a convenient example of its decline. Craddock's jaw tightened. And where were you after the signing? You were seen leaving the bookshop early, but you didn't return to your guest house until 8. Quill's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. I walked the village, Inspector. It's a quaint little place, perfect for reflection. I stopped at the pub for a drink, then returned. I saw nothing of Miss Vance after our conversation. Craddock made a note, unconvinced. The pub landlord doesn't recall you, and you were heard talking about setting things right. Care to explain? Quill's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained smooth. A figure of speech. I was discussing a review with my editor. Nothing to do with Miss Vance. Unsatisfied but lacking grounds to press further, Craddock released him, promising to verify his story. He telephoned Miss Marple, his tone tinged with frustration. Quill's slippery. Miss Marple admits to the argument but claims it was trivial. His alibi's shaky. No one saw him at the pub, and his guest house confirms he was out during the key hours. But we've no evidence tying him to Miss Vance's disappearance. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, considered this. A critic's weapon is his pen, Inspector, but wounded pride can sharpen other tools. I recall a bookseller in my youth, quite different, of course, but he spread rumors about a rival, out of spite, and it led to a most unfortunate incident. Mr. Quill's bitterness may not have driven him to violence, but his presence in the village suggests he wanted something from Miss Vance, an apology, perhaps, or a chance to prove his point. Craddock sighed. I'll check his telephone records and see if his editor backs him up. Meanwhile, we're still searching for Miss Vance. No ransom demands, no sightings. It's like she's vanished into one of her own stories. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Her stories, Inspector, are full of hidden truths. I wonder if Mr. Quill's review struck closer to home than we know. You might ask Mr. Pym if he noticed anything between Quill and Miss Vance before the signing. A man like Quill doesn't attend such events without purpose. As she hung up, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manuscript, the gilded cage, a thread weaving through every suspect's story. Grayson's ambition, Clara's devotion, Lydia's protectiveness, and now Quill's venom. She recalled a passage from Eleanor's earlier work. The sharpest blade is not steel, but a truth. Denied. Had Quill's accusations, true or false, provoked a reaction that led to Eleanor's disappearance? Miss Marple resolved to speak with Mr. Pym herself, to learn more about the critic's behavior at the bookshop. For in St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, every knot held a story, and she was determined to untangle this one. Chapter 7. A clue in the margins. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the outlines of the village's stone cottages, and lending an air of quiet mystery to the lanes. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to such atmospheres, felt a kinship with the fog as she stepped out of Dame Mead Cottage, her basket over her arm and her mind sharp with purpose. The disappearance of Eleanor Vance had settled over the village like a shadow, and though the villagers went about their tasks, Mrs. Muggins sorting letters, the baker unloading his van, their whispers carried a restless curiosity. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by rumor. Her thoughts were fixed on the bookshop, where she believed some overlooked detail might illuminate the novelist's fate. She recalled a vicar's wife from her youth, whose lost diary, found in a forgotten corner, had revealed a secret that changed everything. The smallest things, she murmured, her breath mingling with the mist, often hold the greatest truths. Mr. Pym's bookshop, its windows still dimmed by the previous day's rain, stood quietly at the end of the high street. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, her eyes adjusting to the soft light filtering through dusty panes. Mr. Pym, recovered from his illness but still pale, was arranging a display of Eleanor's novels, his hands trembling. slightly as he stacked copies of The Shadowed Veil. He looked up, startled, and offered a weary smile. "Miss Marple," he said, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. "I suppose you're here about Miss Vance. The police have been in and out, but I've told them all I know." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes bright with interest. "I'm sure you have, Mr. Pym, but I thought I might take a look myself. Sometimes, you know, a fresh pair of eyes sees what others miss. Might I examine the table where Miss Vance was signing?" Mr. Pym hesitated, then nodded, leading her to the green baize table in the corner, still cluttered with papers and a few unsold books. "It's just as she left it," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "I haven't had the heart to tidy it, what with all this trouble." Miss Marple set her basket down and began to sift through the items with care, her fingers delicate but purposeful. There were bookmarks, a half-empty ink bottle, and a scattering of promotional leaflets for The Gilded Cage, Eleanor's unpublished work. Her eyes fell on a slim stack of galley proofs for The Shadowed Veil, their edges worn from handling. As she leafed through them, she noticed faint pencil marks in the margins, Eleanor's precise handwriting, noting corrections and, curiously, a series of cryptic phrases. "The treasure lies hidden. Beware the gilded cage, and truth in the shadows." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "How extraordinary," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "A manuscript, Mr. Pym, is more than words. It's a motive." She turned to the bookshop owner, who was hovering nervously. "Did Miss Vance speak of her new book at all? These notes suggest it holds something special." Mr. Pym rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. "She was tight-lipped about The Gilded Cage. Miss Marple said it was her most personal work yet, something that would change everything. Mr. Grayson was after it like a hound, kept asking when she'd deliver it. She didn't like his pestering, told me. She wanted to keep it safe until she was sure of it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Safe. An interesting choice of word. "And did anyone else show interest in this manuscript?" Mr. Pym thought for a moment. "Miss Trent, the young lady, asked about it during the signing. Kept saying it would be Miss Vance's masterpiece. And Mr. Quill, that critic, made some snide remark about it being more of the same. But Mrs. Brooke was the one who seemed most protective, told me to keep any talk of it quiet. Said it was Eleanor's legacy." Miss Marple tucked the galley proofs under her arm, promising to return them, and thanked Mr. Pym. As she stepped into the misty street, her mind was alight with possibilities. The notes in the margins suggested Eleanor had woven something into The Gilded Cage's secret, perhaps, or a revelation that made it more than a novel. She recalled a painter in her youth, whose final canvas had hidden a coded message, discovered only after his death. Could Eleanor's manuscript hold a similar key? She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice steady despite the excitement stirring within her. "Inspector, I've found something at the bookshop notes in Miss Vance's hand, hinting at a hidden treasure in her new manuscript. I believe The Gilded Cage is at the heart of her disappearance. You might ask Mr. Grayson, Miss Trent, and Mrs. Brooke about their interest in it. And Mr. Quill, his scorn may hide a deeper curiosity." Craddock, at the station, was grappling with a lack of progress. "A manuscript as motive," he said, his tone skeptical but attentive. "It's possible, Miss Marple. We've searched Miss Vance's hotel room and Carnot's sign of any manuscript. Grayson swears he doesn't have it, and Miss Trent says she only asked about it out of admiration. Mrs. Brooke clams up when I mention it, and Quill just laughs it off. I'm sending a constable to check Eleanor's London flat, but I'm not holding my breath." Miss Marple's needles, though still in her basket, seemed to click in her mind. "A missing manuscript, Inspector, is like a missing person. It leaves traces, if you know where to look. You might inquire if anyone saw Miss Vance with a satchel or case at the signing. And the lane behind the bookshop, have you found anything more there?" Craddock sighed. "Just those tire marks, too muddied to be useful." but we're canvassing the neighbors again. Someone must have seen something. Miss Marple hung up, her thoughts racing. She decided to visit Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for gossip often unearthed nuggets of truth. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry was in her drawing room, surrounded by gardening magazines, her face lighting up at the sight of her friend. "Jane, you're deep in this mystery, aren't you?" she said, pouring tea. "What's this about?" "A manuscript. Arthur says Grayson's been boasting about some big book that'll save his firm." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "The Gilded Cage, Dolly. It seems to be the prize everyone wants. Grayson, for profit. Clara for devotion. Lydia for legacy. And perhaps Quill to discredit. I found notes suggesting it holds a secret, something Eleanor called a treasure. I wonder if she hid it, or if someone took it with her." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "A secret? Like in her novels?" "Oh, Jane, do you think she was writing about something real?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Her stories are full of hidden truths, much like people. I recall a young clerk in my nephew's village, quite different, of course, but he hid a letter in a book, thinking it safe. It was found, and the truth came out. I suspect The Gilded Cage is not just a story, but a key." As she left Gossington Hall, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the lane behind the bookshop. She resolved to walk there herself, to see if the mist and mud had preserved any clue Craddock's men had overlooked. The lane, narrow and bordered by high hedges, was silent, its cobbles slick with rain. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the ground, and paused at a spot where the mud was churned, as if a car had idled there. Near the edge, half buried in the damp earth, was a small object, a silver pen cap, its surface etched with the initials. E.V. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and tucked it into her basket, knowing it might be nothing or everything. Back at home, she telephoned Craddock again. "Inspector, I've found a pen cap in the lane, marked with Miss Vance's initials. It may have fallen from her bag or pocket. I think someone took her from that lane, perhaps in a car, and the manuscript with her. You might have it examined for prints." Craddock's voice was a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You're a wonder, Miss Marple. I'll send a constable to collect it. If it's hers, it's the first solid clue we've got." As she hung up, Miss Marple settled by her fire. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The pen cap, the notes, the missing manuscript all pointed to a plan, one driven by the lure of the Gilded Cage. She recalled another line from Eleanor's work. "The truth is a cage, gilded but unyielding." Whatever truth Eleanor had woven into her novel, Miss Marple was certain it had drawn someone to act, and she was determined to find out who. Chapter 8. The alibi unravels. The mist had lifted from St. Mary Mead by mid-morning, leaving the village bathed in a pale, watery sunlight that did little to dispel the unease lingering in its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor at Mead Cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her thoughts were far from the soft wool in her hands. The discovery of Eleanor Vance's pen cap in the lane behind the bookshop had sharpened her focus, confirming her suspicion that the novelist's disappearance was no mere flight of fancy, but a calculated act. Her mind turned to Harold Grayson, the publisher whose shaky alibi and financial woes made him a figure of growing interest. She recalled a merchant in her youth, whose charming facade had crumbled under the weight of his debts, leading to a desperate scheme that unraveled with a single, careless mistake. "Greed," she murmured, her eyes narrowing, "leaves footprints, even when one treads lightly." Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, was at the police station, his desk buried under reports and half-drunk cups of tea. The pen cap, now in the hands of his forensic team, had yielded no clear fingerprints, but its presence in the lane had bolstered his determination to press Grayson harder. Miss Marple's call about the galley-proof notes and the manuscript, The Gilded Cage, had shifted his perspective. What he had initially thought might be a spontaneous act now seemed premeditated, driven by the promise of a literary prize. He telephoned Miss Marple, his voice taut with urgency. "Miss Marple, we've checked the train records again. The 5:15 to London was delayed until 5:35, but the porter swears no one matching Grayson's description boarded. He's lying about his movements, and I'm bringing him in again." Miss Marple, her needles pausing, nodded to herself. "A wise decision, Inspector. A man who lies about a train is often hiding more than his whereabouts. You might ask him about the gilded cage. Its absence is as telling as its value. And perhaps," she added, her tone gentle but pointed, "you might search his rooms at the Blue Boar. A man in a hurry sometimes forgets what he leaves behind." Craddock, grateful for her insight, dispatched a constable to the inn while he prepared for Grayson's interview. Miss Marple, meanwhile, decided to take her morning walk to the High Street, where the village's pulse beat strongest. The post office was abuzz, and Mrs. Muggins, ever eager to share, leaned over the counter as Miss Marple approached. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Heard the police are after that Grayson fellow again. I saw him yesterday, you know, coming out of the Blue Boar, with a face like thunder. Looked like a man with the world on his shoulders." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was alert. "Did he? Now? And did he say anything, Mrs. Muggins?" "Not to me," the postmistress replied, "but he was on his telephone, muttering about making it right, and no choice. Sounded proper desperate, if you ask me." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the street, her thoughts weaving a tighter pattern. Grayson's desperation, coupled with his false alibi, suggested a man teetering on the edge. She recalled a line from The Shadowed Vale: "A man, in chains of his own making, will break any vow to free himself." Had Grayson, chained by debt, broken more than a promise to secure Eleanor's manuscript? At the station, Craddock faced Grayson in the interview room, the publisher's florid face, now pale with strain. His suit, though still expensive, was rumpled, and his hands fidgeted with a gold cufflink. "Inspector, this is absurd," Grayson began, his voice blustering but unsteady. "I've told you, I left the bookshop at 5, drove to the station, and took the train to London. I had a meeting with my accountant, urgent business." Craddock's eyes were steely. "The porter doesn't recall you, Mr. Grayson, and no one saw you board. Yet you were spotted in the village lane at 6:30, near the bookshop. Care to explain?" Grayson's jaw tightened, and he mopped his brow with his handkerchief. "A misunderstanding. I missed the train, that's all. Decided to walk it off, clear my head. The lane's quiet, good for thinking." Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "And what were you thinking about? Miss Vance's manuscript, perhaps? We know you were pressing her for the gilded cage. Your firm's in trouble, isn't it? That book could save you." Grayson's eyes flickered, but he forced a laugh. "My firm's fine, Inspector. And yes, I wanted the manuscript. It's a masterpiece, worth a fortune. But Eleanor was stubborn, kept delaying. I spoke to her about it at the signing, but she brushed me off. I left her at the table, signing. For that fangirl." Craddock pressed harder. "And you didn't go back? Didn't wait in the lane, perhaps with a car, to have a private word?" Grayson's face reddened. "That's preposterous. I'm a businessman, not a criminal." The interview was interrupted by the constable's return from the Blue Boar, carrying a small locked box found in Grayson's room. Craddock, with Grayson's reluctant permission, opened it, revealing a typed letter from Eleanor Vance, dated a week before the signing. It read, "Dear Mr. Grayson, I cannot deliver the gilded cage until my royalties are paid in full. Your firm's delays are intolerable, and I will not be pressured. Yours, E.V." A second document, a financial ledger, showed Grayson and Sons teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, with a note scrawled in Grayson's hand: "Eleanor's book, last hope. Craddock's voice was cold. "You lied about the train, Mr. Grayson? And you've been hiding this. Care to tell the truth now?" Grayson slumped, his bluster fading. "All right," he said, his voice low. "I didn't take the train. I went back to the bookshop, hoping to convince Eleanor to hand over the manuscript. I waited in the lane, but she was already gone when I got there. I swear, I didn't touch her." Craddock, unconvinced, detained him for further questioning, and telephoned Miss Marple, his tone a mix of triumph and frustration. Grayson's cracked. Miss Marple admits he was in the lane, but claims he didn't see her. That letter and ledger are damning. He had every reason to want that manuscript, but we've still got no proof he took her, and no sign of Miss Vance. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, considered this. Money, Inspector, makes even the respectable act rashly. I recall a shopkeeper in my youth, quite different, of course. But he stole from his own till to save his name. Mr. Grayson's desperation is clear, but his story of finding the shop empty intrigues me. Did Mrs. Brooke mention locking the back door? Craddock checked his notes. She said she locked both doors, front and back, at 6. If Grayson's telling the truth, someone else got to Miss Vance first. Miss Marple's needles clicked, softly, or someone was with her when he arrived. You might ask Mrs. Brooke again about that back door, and whether she saw Grayson's car. And perhaps, Inspector, a search of Grayson's office in London might reveal more about his plans for the gilded cage. Craddock agreed, promising to follow up. Miss Marple, setting her knitting aside, gazed out at the village, where the sunlight was fading into dusk. Grayson's unraveling alibi was a step forward, but the absence of the manuscript and Eleanor herself suggested a deeper plot. She recalled another line from the shadowed veil. The truth hides not in lies, but in what is left unsaid. What had Grayson left unsaid, and who else might be guarding a silence? She resolved to speak with Clara Trent again, for the fan's devotion might hold a clue to the moments Grayson claimed to have missed. In St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, every loose end led somewhere, and Miss Marple was determined to follow this one to its source. Chapter 9. The fan's confession. The soft glow of late afternoon filtered through the lace curtains of Dame Mead Cottage, casting delicate shadows across Miss Jane Marple's parlor. Outside, St. Mary Mead was settling into the quiet rhythm of an autumn evening. The village's earlier bustle replaced by the gentle clink of teacups and the murmur of fireside conversations. Yet Miss Marple, seated with her knitting in her lap, felt no such calm. The unraveling of Harold Grayson's alibi had tightened the web of suspicion around him, but her thoughts kept drifting to Clara Trent, the young fan whose devotion to Eleanor Vance bordered on obsession. There was something in Clara's trembling sincerity, Miss Marple mused, that reminded her of a parlor-maid from years past, whose fierce loyalty to a wayward brother had led her to conceal his misdeeds. Love, she said softly, her needles pausing, can be a veil, hiding truth even from the one who wears it. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple decided to revisit Clara at her cottage, hoping a second conversation might uncover what the girl had left unsaid. She donned her coat and hat, her basket tucked under her arm, and set out along the damp lanes, where the scent of wet leaves mingled with wood smoke. The Trent cottage, with its overgrown garden and peeling paint, seemed even more forlorn in the fading light. Miss Marple knocked, and after a long pause, Clara opened the door, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She clutched a worn copy of The Shadowed Veil. Its cover creased from countless readings. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have they found her? Is there news?" "Not yet, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "But I thought you might help shed light on that evening at the bookshop. You were so fond of Miss Vance, and fond hearts often see what others miss. May I come in?" Clara hesitated, then stepped aside, leading Miss Marple into the cluttered sitting room. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper, and every surface was strewn with Eleanor's novels, their pages marked with notes and underlined passages. Miss Marple settled into the same faded armchair as before, her eyes noting a new addition, a small notebook on the table, its pages filled with Clara's tight, fervent handwriting. "You've been writing, I see," Miss Marple said, her voice warm with interest. "Letters to Miss Vance, perhaps?" Clara flushed, her fingers tightening on her book. "Not letters, exactly. Just thoughts about her stories, what they mean to me. I wanted to tell her, but I never got the chance." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "You went back to the bookshop that evening, you said, to see if she was all right. You saw Mr. Grayson in the lane, arguing on his telephone. Did you see anyone else? Or hear anything? A car, perhaps? Or voices?" Clara's gaze dropped to the floor, and she twisted a lock of hair nervously. I didn't want to say before. I was afraid it would make things worse for her, but yes, I heard a car. It was after Mr. Grayson left, maybe 6:30 or so. I was standing by the hedge, out of sight. The car stopped in the lane, and I heard a door open, then close. I didn't see who it was. I was too scared to look. I thought maybe Miss Vance was leaving, but her car was still there when I checked later." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "How brave of you to stay, my dear, despite your fear. And you're certain you didn't see the driver?" Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I should have looked. I should have helped her. I love her stories so much. She's like a friend, even if she doesn't know me. I thought if I could just talk to her, she'd understand." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice kind but firm. "And did you ever see her with anything? A bag, perhaps? Or a case that might hold her manuscript?" Clara's eyes widened. Her manuscript? The gilded cage? She had a leather satchel at the signing, kept it close under the table. I noticed because she checked it every so often, like she was worried about it. I didn't see it when I went back, though. Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts racing. She recalled a young governess in her youth, whose diary, filled with ardent scribbles, had revealed a truth she dared not speak aloud. "You've been very helpful, Clara," she said, rising. "But if you remember anything else, you must tell the police. Sometimes the smallest detail can unlock a great mystery." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind turned to the car in the lane, a detail that aligned with the neighbor's report to Craddock. Clara's confession, though tearful, had a ring of truth, but her hesitation suggested she might still be holding something back. Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice steady, despite the chill seeping through her coat. "Inspector, Miss Trent has admitted to hearing a car in the lane around 6:30, after Grayson's departure. She didn't see the driver, but she confirms Miss Vance had a satchel at the signing, likely holding the gilded cage. You might press her gently, she's fragile, but her devotion may have made her a witness to more than she realizes." Craddock, at the station, was poring over Grayson's financial records, his frustration mounting. "That's a breakthrough, Miss Marple. Clara's coming in this afternoon for a formal statement. We've also searched Grayson's office in London, nothing but contracts and bills. No manuscript. But that letter from Miss Vance, refusing to deliver the gilded cage, has him rattled. He's still claiming he found the bookshop empty, but I'm not buying it." Miss Marple's needles, though still in her basket, seemed to click in her mind. "A satchel, Inspector, is easily carried, easily hidden. If Miss Vance was taken from the lane, her manuscript likely went with her. You might ask Mrs. Brooke again about the back door. Clara's story suggests someone left through it, and Mrs. Brooke was the last to lock up." Craddock agreed, promising to re-interview the librarian. Miss Marple, returning home, paused at the garden gate to exchange a few words with Mrs. Bantry, who was raking leaves with her usual vigor. "Jane, you're up to your neck in this, aren't you?" Mrs. Bantry said, leaning on her rake. I heard Clara Trent was seen crying at the post office this morning. Poor girl, she's mad about Miss Vance, isn't she? Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Mad, perhaps, but not foolish. She heard a car in the lane, Dolly, and saw Miss Vance's satchel at the signing. I recall a young woman in my nephew's village, quite different, of course, but she watched her beloved from afar, noting every detail. It led to a discovery no one expected. Clara's love for Miss Vance may yet lead us to the truth. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled. You think she saw something she's not telling? I think, Miss Marple said, that her heart sees Miss Vance as a savior, and saviors are hard to betray, even unintentionally. She may know more than she can bear to say. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her stitches. Clara's confession had added a new thread to the tapestry, a car, a satchel, a moment unseen. She recalled a passage from the shadowed veil. The heart that clings to another's light casts shadows of its own. Had Clara's devotion cast a shadow over a vital clue, or was she merely a bystander to another's act? The manuscript, the gilded cage, remained the key, its absence a silent accusation against Grayson. Yet Clara's account suggested someone else had moved swiftly that night. Miss Marple resolved to revisit the bookshop lane, to see if the daylight might reveal what the mist had hidden. For in St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, every stitch told a story, and she was determined to follow this one to its end. Chapter 10. The librarian's silence. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned crisp and clear, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the village green, where dew still clung to the grass. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table, with a pot of tea, gazed out at the quiet lanes, her mind as sharp as the light cutting through the mist. Clara Trent's confession about the car in the lane had added a new thread to the mystery of Eleanor Vance's disappearance. But it was Mrs. Lydia Brooke, the librarian, who now occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. Lydia's stern silence about the bookshop's back door, coupled with her fierce guardianship of Eleanor's legacy, suggested a loyalty that might conceal more than it revealed. Miss Marple recalled a village nurse from her youth, whose devotion to a patient had led her to withhold a truth that might have saved another. Silence, she murmured, stirring her tea, is a wall, but walls have cracks. Determined to probe Lydia's reticence, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her basket over her arm, and set out for the library. The village was stirring, with children scampering to school, and the postman making his rounds. But the air carried a lingering unease, as if Eleanor's absence had left an echo. The library, with its stone facade and polished oak door, stood as a bastion of order, its stillness a stark contrast to the village's murmurs. Inside, Mrs. Brooke was at her post, her glasses glinting as she sorted a stack of returns with her usual precision. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her expression guarded but polite. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooke," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but laced with purpose. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I've been thinking about poor Miss Vance, and as you were the last to lock up the bookshop, I wondered if you might recall anything new." Lydia's hand stilled on the books, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've told the police all I know, Miss Marple," she said, her tone clipped. "I locked both doors at 6, after checking the shop was empty. Miss Vance must have left before I returned from the back room. I heard nothing, saw nothing." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "Nothing at all, not even a car in the lane. A young lady mentioned hearing one around 6:30, just after Mr. Grayson was seen there." Lydia's fingers twitched, and a faint flush crept up her neck, quickly suppressed. "The lane is often used by delivery vans," she said, adjusting her glasses. "I didn't notice anything unusual. My concern was securing the shop, not watching the street." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the glass case where Eleanor's manuscripts were displayed. their pages a silent testament to Lydia's devotion. "You've done so much for Miss Vance's work," she said softly. "Those drafts are a treasure, are they not? I imagine you'd do anything to protect her legacy." Lydia's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "Stories are her gift to the world. I've known her since she was a struggling writer, sending me her early work for safekeeping. She trusted me to preserve it, not let it be cheapened by men like Grayson." Miss Marple's fingers brushed her basket, noting the edge in Lydia's tone. "Men like Grayson. You mentioned his pressure on her before. Did you see them together that evening, perhaps arguing?" Lydia hesitated, her hands clasping a book tightly. "I heard them before the signing," she admitted. "Grayson was badgering her about the gilded cage, saying his firm depended on it. Eleanor told him to wait, that it wasn't ready. I didn't see them after that. Ty was busy with the crowd." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And the back door, Mrs. Brooke. You locked it yourself. Did you check the lane at all?" Lydia's flush deepened, and she looked away. I glanced out, but it was dark. I saw nothing, Miss Marple. I locked the door and went home." Sensing the librarian's discomfort, Miss Marple thanked her and left, pausing under the library's awning to consider her words. Lydia's insistence on seeing nothing was too resolute, too practiced. Miss Marple recalled a seamstress in her youth, whose silence about a theft had stemmed from a misguided sense of duty. Had Lydia, out of loyalty to Eleanor, ignored something? In the Linné car, a figure, a sound that pointed to the truth. She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice calm but urgent. "Inspector, Mrs. Brooke remained steadfast that she saw nothing in the lane, but I find her." Silence telling. She heard Grayson and Miss Vance argue about the gilded cage, and her devotion to Eleanor is profound. "You might ask her directly about the car Clara heard. She may have chosen not to notice it, to protect someone or something." Craddock, at the station, was reviewing Clara's statement, his desk a chaos of notes. "I'm bringing Mrs. Brooke in this afternoon, Miss Marple. Clara's story about the car checks out. A neighbor confirmed hearing an engine around 6:30, though no one saw it clearly. Grayson's still our main suspect, but Mrs. Brooke's silence is odd. She locked that back door. How could she miss a car?" Miss Marple's mind raced. "Loyalty, Inspector, can blind one to what is plain. I recall a housekeeper in my youth quite different, of course, but she kept quiet about a stolen ring to shield her mistress. Mrs. Brooke may believe she's protecting Eleanor by saying nothing. You might also ask about her movements after locking up. Did she go straight home, or linger?" Craddock promised to press harder, and hung up. Miss Marple, stepping back into the village, decided to visit Mrs. Bantry, whose garden was a reliable source of both roses and gossip. She found her friend pruning a late-blooming shrub, her cheeks flushed with exertion. "Jane, you're tireless," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, brushing dirt from her gloves. "What's this about Lydia Brooke? I heard she was snippy with the police this morning." Miss Marple settled on a garden bench, her basket beside her. "Lydia is a puzzle, Dolly. She insists she saw nothing in the lane, yet a car was heard there, and she was the last to lock up. Her loyalty to Miss Vance is fierce, but I wonder if it's led her to overlook something or someone." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think she's covering for Grayson? Or maybe she saw something and doesn't want to admit it?" "Not covering, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, "but choosing silence over truth. She spoke of Grayson's greed with such disdain, yet she's silent about the lane. I recall a line from The Shadowed Vale. The heart guards what it loves, even at the cost of justice. Lydia's heart guards Eleanor's legacy, but at what cost?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, intrigued. "You think she knows where Eleanor is?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that she knows more than she says, even to herself. A car in the lane, a satchel with a manuscript. A moment unseen. These are pieces of a pattern, and Lydia holds one of them. Back at Mead cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts weaving a tighter web. Lydia's silence was a shield, but shields could crack under pressure. She recalled the pen cap in the lane, the notes in the galley proofs, Clara's tearful confessional, pointing to a moment in that quiet alley where Eleanor had vanished. Had Lydia, in her devotion, seen something she refused to acknowledge? Or had she, perhaps, played a role she dared not admit? Miss Marple resolved to visit the bookshop lane again, to search for any trace the police might have missed, for in St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, every silence held a story, and she was determined to hear this one. Chapter 11. The critic's motive. The late morning light filtered through the bare branches of St. Mary Mead's elms, casting a lattice of shadows across the village lanes. Miss Jane Marple, stepping out of Mead cottage with her basket and a fresh resolve, felt the crisp air sharpen her senses. The mystery of Eleanor Vance's disappearance had woven a complex tapestry, with threads of greed, devotion, and loyalty entwining around the elusive manuscript, the gilded cage. Yet it was Vincent Quill, the acerbic critic, who now drew her attention. His venomous review of Eleanor's work and his unexpected presence at the bookshop suggested a motive beyond mere professional disdain. Miss Marple recalled a curate from her youth, whose sharp tongue had hidden a personal slight that festered into a quiet act of sabotage. Bitterness, she murmured, adjusting her hat, is a poison that seeps into action. Quill's guest house, on the village's edge, was a modest establishment, its faded charm suited to those who preferred solitude. Miss Marple, under the pretense of collecting for the church restoration fund, knocked at the door, greeted by Mrs. Cutler's brisk efficiency. The proprietress, wiping flour from her hands, was quick to share her observations. "Mr. Quill's been a right misery since that signing," she said, leading Miss Marple to the parlor. "Snapping at everyone, scribbling in his notebook like a man possessed. I heard him muttering about Miss Vance yesterday, something about proving her wrong." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. Proving her wrong. How curious. Did he say anything else about her, Mrs. Cutler? The landlady shook her head. Not much, but he was on the telephone last night, talking to someone about a reckoning. Said he'd been humiliated long enough. He's in his room now, if you want a word. Miss Marple declined to disturb Quill directly, preferring to gather her thoughts before confronting him. She thanked Mrs. Cutler and left, her mind turning over the critic's words. A reckoning suggested a personal stake, something deeper than a literary feud. She recalled Quill's scathing review, which had accused Eleanor of borrowing heavily from an obscure Victorian novella, charge that had sparked public outcry and, according to Mr. Pym, a heated exchange at the bookshop. Had Quill's pride, wounded by Eleanor's success or her defiance, driven him to act? She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice calm but precise. "Inspector, I've learned Mr. Quill spoke of a reckoning with Miss Vance, and his bitterness seems personal. His review accused her of plagiarism, and I wonder if there's more to that claim. You might search his rooms for any correspondence letters or notes that might reveal his true motive." Craddock, at the station, was sifting through a pile of reports, his patience wearing thin. "Quill's been dodging my questions, Miss Marple, but we've got something." A search of his guest house turned up letters from Eleanor's agent, threatening legal action over his plagiarism accusations. He admitted to confronting her at the signing, demanding a public retraction. Says she laughed him off, which didn't sit well. Miss Marple's needles, though in her basket, seemed to click in her mind. A public slight can sting, Inspector. I recall a schoolmaster in my youth, quite different, of course. But his wounded pride led to a petty theft to discredit a rival. Mr. Quill's presence in the lane that evening, as Mrs. Cutler noted, places him near the time Miss Vance vanished. Did he say where he went after his argument? Craddock checked his notes. Claims he walked to the pub, but the landlord doesn't recall him. He was back at the guest house by 8, looking shaken. According to Mrs. Cutler, I'm starting to think he's hiding something, but kidnapping, it doesn't fit his type 2 physical for a man who lives by his pen. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. A critic destroys with words, Inspector, but a wounded ego can push one beyond habit. You might ask if he saw Miss Vance's satchel, or if he knew of the gilded cage. His accusations may have been a gambit to force her hand. Craddock's interview with Quill, conducted later that day, was a tense affair. The critic, his lean frame taut with irritation, sat in the station's interview room, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm. "This is harassment, Inspector," he snapped, his eyes glinting. "I told you, I argued with Miss Vance about her work, her lack of originality, to be precise. She dismissed me, so I left. I had no reason to linger." Craddock leaned forward, his voice steady. "You wanted a retraction, Mr. Quill? Those letters from her agent suggest you were desperate to save face, and you were in the village lane at 6, near the bookshop, when Miss Vance disappeared. What were you doing there?" Quill's smirk faltered, and he adjusted his tie. "I was walking, clearing my head. Her arrogance infuriated me, but I didn't touch her. I saw nothing in the Leno car, no satchel, nothing." Craddock pressed further, "in the gilded cage. Did you know she was carrying it that day?" Quill's eyes flickered, but he shrugged. "I heard rumors of a new book. More of her derivative drivel, no doubt. I didn't care enough to ask." Unsatisfied, Craddock released him, but ordered a closer watch on his movements. He telephoned Miss Marple, his tone a mix of frustration and respect. "Quill's sticking to his story, Miss Marple, but those letters show he had a grudge. He's too clever to admit anything, and we've no evidence he took her. The satchel's still missing, along with the manuscript. Grayson's our best bet, but Quill's not clear yet." Miss Marple, seated by her fire, considered this. A man like Quill, Inspector, thrives on control of his narrative, his reputation. If Eleanor challenged that, he might have acted to restore it, though perhaps not with violence. I recall a line from The Shadowed Veil. "The sharpest revenge is to prove another wrong." Quill may have wanted to expose Eleanor, not harm her. You might check his notebook. Critics often write their truths before they speak them. Promised to request a warrant for Quill's belongings, and hung up. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, let her thoughts drift to the lane, where the pen cap and tire marks hinted at a swift departure. Quill's motive, rooted in pride, seemed less tangible than Grayson's greed or Clara's devotion, yet no less potent. She recalled a bookseller in her youth, whose envy of a rival had led to a subtle sabotage, unnoticed until the damage was done. Had Quill, in his quest for vindication, played a role in Eleanor's disappearance, or was he merely a bystander with a grudge? She decided to visit Mrs. Bantry, whose gossip often held kernels of truth. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry was in her conservatory, tending to a wilting fern. "Jane, you're relentless," she said, brushing soil from her hands. "What's this about Vincent Quill? I heard he was practically sneering at the police." Miss Marple settled into a wicker chair, her basket beside her. "Quill is a man of pride, Dolly, and pride can be a dangerous master. He accused Eleanor of plagiarism, and her refusal to bow stung him. I wonder if he sought to prove his point, perhaps by seeking her manuscript." Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. "You think he stole it? To expose her?" "Not stole, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but watched, waited, perhaps followed. His kind thrives on being right. Yet the car in the lane, the missing satchelet points to action, not observation. I think Quill knows more than he says, even if he didn't act himself." As she left Gossington Hall, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the gilded cage, the manuscript that seemed to draw all eyes. Quill's venom, like Grayson's greed, Clara's devotion, and Lydia's loyalty, was another thread in the pattern, but the pattern's center remained elusive. She resolved to revisit the bookshop lane, to search for any trace of Quill's presence that evening, for in St. Mary Mead, as in her knitting, every grudge left a mark, and she was determined to find this one. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The pale light of an autumn afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, softening the edges of its stone cottages, and lending a deceptive calm to the village. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor at Dane Mead Cottage, had arranged her chintz-covered chairs in a semicircle, a tray of tea and scones on the table before her. The fire crackled softly, casting warmth across the room, but her eyes, bright and unyielding, held the sharpness of a mind that had unraveled the threads of Eleanor Vance's disappearance. She had invited Inspector Craddock, Harold Grayson, Clara Trent, Lydia Brooke, and Vincent Quill to her cottage, ostensibly for tea, but with a purpose far more pointed. The mystery of the vanished novelist, she knew, was about to be laid bare, and in the quiet of her parlor, truths long hidden would find the light. Inspector Craddock arrived first, his face weary but alert, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair, "I hope this isn't just a social call. Grayson's still in custody, but we've no hard evidence to charge him, and Miss Vance is still missing. I trust you've something up your sleeve." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needles resting in her lap. "Patience, Inspector. A mystery, like a good pattern, reveals itself when all the threads are in place. We shall see what our guests have to say." Clara Trent arrived next, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands clutching a worn copy of The Shadowed Veil. She sat nervously, casting glances at the door as if expecting Eleanor herself to appear. Lydia Brooke followed, her posture rigid, her glasses glinting with a mix of defiance and unease. Vincent Quill entered with a sardonic smirk, his lean frame draped in a dark coat, his fingers twitching as if longing for his pen. Finally, Harold Grayson was escorted in by a constable, his florid face pale, his expensive suit creased from a night in a cell. He avoided the other's eyes, his hands fidgeting with a handkerchief. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual grace, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "The disappearance of Miss Vance has troubled us all, and I believe the truth lies here, among us. Let us piece it together, shall we?" Grayson shifted uncomfortably, his voice gruff. "This is ridiculous. I've told the police everything. I didn't touch Eleanor. I was in the lane, yes, but she was gone when I got there." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Mr. Grayson, but your presence in the lane, after claiming to have taken a train, was most revealing. Your firm, I understand, is in dire straits, and the gilded cage, Miss Vance's manuscript, was your salvation. You argued with her that evening, did you not, about her refusal to deliver it until her royalties were paid?" Grayson's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, but that's no crime. I needed that book. She was stubborn, holding it back to spite me." Clara gasped, her voice trembling. "How dare you speak of her like that? She was an artist, not your pawn. I saw you in the lane, shouting into your telephone, looking guilty as sin." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone gentle but firm. "Miss Trent, your devotion to Miss Vance is admirable, but it led you to linger that evening, did it not? You heard a car in the lane, after Mr. Grayson left, and saw Miss Vance's satchel at the signing. Yet you said nothing at first, out of fear for her." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. I thought I was protecting her. I heard the car, but I was too scared to look. I should have done something." Miss Marple turned to Lydia Brooke, whose hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Brooke, you locked the bookshop's back door, yet you claim to have seen and heard nothing, no car, no voices. Your loyalty to Miss Vance is profound, but I wonder if it led you to turn a blind eye. A neighbor heard a car at 6:30, and a pen cap with Miss Vance's initials was found in the lane. Did you truly notice nothing? Lydia's flush deepened, and her voice wavered. I heard the car, yes. I glanced out the back door before locking it, but it was dark, and I didn't want to interfere. Eleanor was always so private about her work. I thought she'd left of her own accord. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were precise. You thought, or you hoped. Your devotion to her legacy made you silent, Mrs. Brooke, but silence can shield the guilty as well as the innocent. Vincent Quill, who had been listening with a faint smirk, leaned forward, his voice sharp. This is all very dramatic, Miss Marple, but what has it to do with me? I argued with Eleanor about her plagiarism. Her work's a pastiche of better writers. She dismissed me, so I left. I had no part in this. Miss Marple's eyes met his, unyielding. Your pride, Mr. Quill, was wounded by her defiance. You sought a retraction, a chance to prove her wrong. Your presence in the village that evening, your talk of a reckoning, suggests you were not as detached as you claim. Yet I believe your weapon is words, not deeds. You wanted to expose her, not hide her. Quill's smirk faded, but he said nothing, his fingers still. Miss Marple turned back to the group, her voice steady as she wove the threads together. Let us consider the facts. Miss Vance vanished from the bookshop, her satchel with the gilded cage gone with her. A car was heard in the lane, and a pen cap found there bears her initials. Mr. Grayson, desperate for the manuscript, lied about his whereabouts, returning to the bookshop to press Miss Vance. Miss Trent, in her devotion, watched from the shadows, hearing a car but seeing no driver. Mrs. Brooke, loyal to Eleanor's legacy, locked the back door but ignored the sound of a car, perhaps believing Eleanor had chosen to leave. Mr. Quill, driven by pride, sought to discredit her but lacked the means for more. She paused, her eyes resting on Grayson. Mr. Grayson, your firm owns a cottage near Much Benham, does it not? A quiet place, ideal for a writer or for hiding one. I believe you lured Miss Vance there, under the pretense of a meeting, to secure the gilded cage. The car in the lane was yours, and the satchel went with her. Grayson's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands. I didn't mean to hurt her, he muttered. I just needed the manuscript. She wouldn't give it up, kept saying it wasn't ready. I told her we'd talk at the cottage, drove her there myself. She's safe, I swear, just shaken. The manuscript's with her. Craddock leaped to his feet, his voice sharp. Where is she, Grayson? Tell me now. Grayson's voice was hoarse. The cottage on Willow Lane. She's locked in, but unharmed. I was going to let her go once she agreed to hand it over. Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face, while Lydia's hands trembled, her silence now a weight she could no longer bear. Quill's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of grudging respect. Craddock dispatched a constable to the cottage, his face a mix of relief and anger. Within the hour, word came. Eleanor Vance was found, shaken but safe, her satchel clutched tightly. The gilded cage inside. The manuscript, as Miss Marple had suspected, held notes hinting at a scandal in the publishing world, the truth Grayson had feared would ruin him if revealed. As the guests dispersed, Craddock lingered, his notebook closed. Miss Marple, you're a marvel. How did you know it was the cottage? She smiled, her needles clicking softly. People, Inspector, are never quite what they seem, but their secrets always find the light. I recalled a line from the gilded cage, quoted in a letter Eleanor sent to Mrs. Brooke. A cage is only as strong as the will to escape it. Grayson's cage was his greed, but Eleanor's will was stronger. As the village returned to its quiet rhythm, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady comfort. The mystery was solved, but the human heart, she knew, would always weave new ones. In St. Mary Mead, as in her patterns, every thread had its place, and she was content to have found theirs.